said on that screen in the last 55 minutes, much of what was said in the course of today. What constraints, what opportunities, what particular characteristics do you as a filmmaker enjoy or feel to make something like that informs us as you have?
Oh, it varies with the subject. You know, I mean, the interesting thing about television is it's an enormously broad audience. You know, you don't get any broader than that. And, you know, while you can't please everybody, it's always my approach to try and look at it from a different perspective than we normally think about it. You know, here's Charles Bean. He's the guy who wrote the war history. He's the official correspondent. You know, we think we know the story of this guy. And in fact, you don't, because there's a whole backstory. There's what he did, where he came from, things he said, his life with his wife, you know. So very generally, the approach is to try and expand that story out as, you know, as big as possible. Because in TV land, what we talk about sometimes is we talk about the audience that we've already got, you know. And so you'll say, you know, I already have the audience that's going to watch a documentary about Charles Bean. What I need is the people who are not going to watch it, you know. So that's the approach, really.
Great questions. You know, it might be a small enough theatre that we don't need the microphone. So please, anyone wants to... This is a golden opportunity. You've got Wayne here, and now's your chance.
Do you see what I mean? I think he's a much more interesting man than is frequently portrayed. You know, like as I talked before we started, it was the contrast in the man. You know, this tremendously disciplined man who is capable of doing and saying the most ill-disciplined things. The nerdy scholar who had great bravery, the man who could have been the establishment, knocks back a knighthood. You know, it's just every time you think you've got hold of this man, he slips out of your hand like a bar of soap. He's delightfully naive and irascible at his best. You know, and he's tremendously principled. You know, most of us like to think we are principled, but most of us will never be tested. I often think about turning down that knighthood, and maybe even, wouldn't you just do it for Effie? You know, I would have, and still his principles wouldn't let him do that. You know, I just would have thought, what a great gift to her.
It's a shame Effie didn't keep a diary. Martin?
Yeah.
Well, the scene I knew nothing about truly delighted me was that scene of him at the end of the Second World War, dragging out a soapbox to go and talk to the people and say, this is what you have to do.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing I like about him, also, I mean, he had a good innings. What was he, 89? But the thing that's really interesting is where those 89 years fall. If you think about this man is born into a pre-automobile, certainly pre-aircraft, and you know something that's really interesting to think about Charles Bean? He's born 1 year before Ned Kelly is hanged and lives to see the Apollo space program. I mean, that's just a life we'll never see again. Think about it in those terms. And I always like to think of him to go to your point, he had the wisdom and the disappointment and the anger of someone who'd passed from the Victorian to the modern world. And for that was a big clue for me to his personality.
I mean, I was very impressed by the emphasis in your story on the later part of his life and those aspects that are never mentioned in the popular Anzac tradition, the celebration of Bean, his work with his idealism, his concern for the kindergarten movement, for women, for the family, Parks and Gardens movement, for town planning, for a more socialist agenda. Those things are never mentioned now.
No, they're not. No.
Central to his life.
Yeah, and another great contrast too, an apolitical man who was tremendously political personally in his life. You know, he thought the most important people in society were school teachers. Just flat out. That's it. They're the most important people.
On your website, website, you say he fell in love with Australia.
Yeah.
And Australia broke his heart.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that?
Yeah. He thought, in a nutshell, this is me paraphrasing him, I think. I think he thought that he saw in those men and what they did. And don't you find it interesting that even when he's praising them, he's talking about their mental capacities? Did you notice that? I mean, it was something I noticed again, because I actually haven't seen that for a long time myself. He talked about the capacity to organise themselves cleverly and get things done. And that's like a narrative we don't often hear of the first AIF. I'm sorry, I'm wildly digressing from your question. But he thought these men would come home and just tear this society apart, you know, for the better. You know, that their children would go to great state schools, that their rivers would run clear, their towns would be wide streets with lots of parkland. Everything was just going to work.
He thought they'd come back and build utopia.
Yeah, he did. He did. And he had a good reason to believe they would do that, you know, and he wanted them to do it. And, you know, as he says, you know, that terrible bitterness, we failed. We just failed wretchedly. And I hear echoes there of the times we live in now, where we just handed everything to speculators and bankers, and he doesn't quite say that, but that's what you know, people who actually, you know, our public life just doesn't have any morality to it, you know, is the way he felt about things. And I think he's got a really good point, and I think it's still pertinent today.
Gentleman with the beard.
I find it interesting that the three different things that we're being told. As a journalist, as an editor, and finally to develop the best war memorial I've seen, and I've seen a lot.
Yeah.
It's a war memorial and a museum in one.
Yeah.
Very unusual.
Yeah.
And such a concept.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is. He also... Bean's one of those people that gets misunderstood, and the misunderstanding keeps going. You know, even this notion of him writing an unreadable history or something like that, which I find mildly kind of pejorative. But, you know, even he himself said this is not a history. In fact, he made some classical allusion. I don't know if he talked about Tacitus or a modern Homer, maybe you would know. He said somebody will take this information and write the epic from it, you know, which are in some way, I guess, every author and filmmaker has to some degree since, you know. Yeah, he's really misunderstood in many ways. And I'm not quite sure why.
Yes.
Yes, I was just going to ask, do you think he was a precursor of, well, his standard of journalism is sadly lacking today. When you get complete accuracy and checking his facts before reports and everything like that, he probably turned his grave when he saw what was going on now.
Yeah.
Can you hear at the back?
Yeah.
Even if you ask a question, you need to speak up, otherwise I'll point a microphone at you.
Yes,
So please speak up.
Yes, has he, I mean, it hasn't resulted in an ethics or a mores for the current journalist to follow.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, it hasn't really. No. And there was something else that people were talking about this morning, and I thought was also worthwhile saying. I'm sorry, I'm digressing a little bit. He, when he wrote that article about the troops in Egypt, he really took a lot of stick for that. A lot of stick. Like, there might have even been death threats, whether they were real or not, but, you know, you're going to get it, mate. And then when he gets there, he's not accredited. So as Michael said in the film, he's sitting on the biggest story in the world. He's a journalist and he can't do anything about it. Meanwhile, Ashmead Bartlett's blathering on, and the bloody guy never got off the ship for the entire day, and he gets all the glory. And there was a time there not long after the landing where all the newspapers dropped Bean, or most of them. the Argus, I think the Sydney Morning Herald, they just said, "You're too boring, man." He in fact got fired, kind of. And I just think we forget the cumulative blows this man was able to... Imagine that, just getting there, getting scooped, not having accreditation, almost getting fired, and everyone hates you. And he's a fascinating character that he could absorb all of that and still come out of it.
Can I ask, Anne, would you like to say anything? Because you're in the film too.
About anything in particular, or
Just an opportunity for you to say something, if you'd like.
I remember seeing it and thinking it's a good portrayal of the man as I remember him, and I enjoy again seeing it again tonight because it's consolidated things that have dissipated and it's come together, and it's a good summary and draws out. But I watched him weeding the lawn, and that's one thing I remember. He taught me how to dig out onion weed, and you don't leave any little bits. You've got to get right underneath and get all the seeds.
Yeah.
He says I don't know, and says I've forgotten.
Yes, please.
In the film, you had that discussion about, is it Sir John Monash, and Bean's apparent feelings about him. But then you included at the end that really interesting little snippet where he'd gone through his writings and he'd made a comment.
Yes.
That he'd changed his mind. I wonder why you did that.
It's one of the things I found really attractive about him. Again, a lot of us aren't very good at admitting that we were wrong. And Bean was spectacularly good at both being wrong and admitting that he was wrong. Which is a very interesting combination. And he did do that. He recognised that he was uncharitable and wrong about Monash. And also, like a lot of people, and again, how do you judge him? He wasn't alone in supporting Hitler. In fact,
Accepting Hitler.
I read an article just before I came here. I was flipping through my files, and there's a letter from him about, I think we can trust this man. And what is interesting about history is if you stop there, what are you left with? What type of man are you left with? But if you keep going, you find that he actually publishes an article called Recantation, where which is a wonderful article should you get hold of it, and he explains why he said what he said about Hitler and why he was wrong, and this was why he was wrong, and he's a very, very interesting man like that.
We quoted in the exhibition, of course. Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Charles Borough. Thank you for your film. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I was just wondering which parts, you mentioned which parts you found attractive in Bean. What parts do you find unattractive? What parts do you find challenging to portray? And was there anything that you chose to leave from the film, and why?
Oh dear. Look, to answer the last question, before you set out to make a film, the first thing you say is which 90% of the story am I not going to tell? Because that's just the way it is, and that's very hard. So the task is to take the other 10% and kind of distill it and spread it as broadly as you can. What parts did I not find attractive about him? It's not so much that he had unattractive traits. It's that his unattractive traits were also attractive. He was kind of his own worst enemy in that sense. He could be, his obsessiveness would lead him to be really ill-disciplined, but his obsessiveness would keep him writing a history for 25 years. Do you know what I mean? His strengths were also his weaknesses. So that's what I felt about him, rather than actually finding something that I disliked about him.
And his idealism is double-edged as well, isn't it?
It is. And his naivety is really interesting. There's another article that I always liked about him, where he suggested that the Kimberley in Western Australia would be a really good homeland for the Jews. there goes your anti-Semitism, you know. And that now sounds absolutely absurd, you know, but if you put it in context, the whole Zionist movement in the late 19th, early 20th century wasn't necessarily centred on, you know, Palestine and Jerusalem. That's right, and Madagascar and everything. Yeah, well, he writes this whole article about there's the Northwest Kimberley. Now, we're not doing anything with that. He's an industrious people. Why don't we give him that? And that's what I mean about his fabulous naivety, that you know, it's enjoyable and yeah.
There's on that anti-Semitism and his ability to acknowledge it, in the folder at the War Memorial, which has the reviews for Volume 1, there's a letter from someone in Melbourne who's saying, I really enjoyed your history, but I can't understand why you have to focus on John Monish's Jewishness. He said, what has that got to do with anything? And he gets, and this is a Jewish man writing, and he attacks me for it and says, it's just rubbish. And Bean was honest enough to keep put it in the fire. So that's what came back.
Yeah, right.
And it's quite possible that that sort of letter, he would have dwelt on it, reflected on it, and it changes his behaviour. It changes his ideas later on. Yeah, great example. Yes?
Did you come across the photographer Wilkins?
I'm sorry, the what?
The photographer Wilkins.
Oh, Hubert Wilkins. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because it wasn't mentioned at all.
Oh, look, there's a similar thing. You could mention Lambert. I know we mentioned Lambert at Gallipoli, but yeah, there are Wilkins.
Pretty better than Hurley.
Yeah, very good reason to believe that. Yeah, yeah.
Gallup did the same thing with the light horse. Right, and the bird guys.
Yeah.
He didn't get much information there.
Okay.
No one in the Middle East campaign in World War I got any mention. It was all France.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Chevelle is marvellous.
Yeah.
Can I... Oh, another one. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that I was very impressed with the way you structured the film, and particularly dealing with the Western Front. I was wondering whether you saw that as a problem, and do you have any comments to make about that little bit of the film?
You know, sometimes when you make a film, there can be a real danger that the subject matter can hijack the film. And by that I mean it was really important not to make a history of the Great War, which it could have so easily have been. Do you know what I mean? And so I guess looking at it then, I thought the reason I spent so much time at Gallipoli and then kind of just went through the Western Front a little was Gallipoli was kind of setting up what type of person he was, where he came from, where his experience was. And also I'm thinking ahead that it's going to be important that he goes back there, you know, which is the start of his recollections, if you like, you know, with the whole Gallipoli mission thing. But yeah, look, just time, you know.
Exactly.
Had to move through the Western Front quickly.
Yeah, one of the things I really admire about filmmakers, and I don't have to be nice to you,
Yes.
is that authors, if authors get obsessed by something, they add another chapter, and the publisher might get a bit stroppy, but nobody's really that bothered. But with you, with especially with TV, there's a format, there's a rigid format, and you've got to weigh every second, haven't you?
Oh yeah.
So the discipline of the filmmaker is preeminent.
Yeah, and it depends what you do. You wouldn't know it, or maybe you did. There's a couple of spots in there that I find curiously flat, where they're commercial breaks. Where they end, and then you get another image come up, and it sits there for a little while, and you kind of go, that's a little bit slow. Well, there's a thing for dog food and a Toyota in there. And you've got to write those things in, you know.
Yes, we've got two more. Will Davies.
Peter, I think it's important to put this film in a broader historical television context also.
Can I just interrupt and say Will Davies is also a filmmaker?
Because television pretty much, even the ABC, with a bit of an exception, hate history. They hate military history in particular. And what Wayne's film has done is kicked down the door. A few others have done it, but it's very, very hard. And I think, he and the team, for that reason, and the subject matter, should be congratulated. It's a Foxtel History Channel production, which, and I know them very well, I've made films for them, as you and I have. But even a History Channel in Australia find it very hard to tell Australian history, and well done.
Yeah, thank you. The difficult thing, of course, thank you very much.
Another chance, don't worry.
Oh, sorry, I've got to tell you a little anecdote about that. I don't know if you've seen it. I made a film called Love Letters from a War.
Yeah, it's great.
It's a very, very beautiful, poignant film. It's about a man, his wife, and their 8 children. And it's all of the letters, because we have all of the letters between him, his wife, and his 8 children. A very unique archive, possibly unique. He was a Victorian. And they came through the Depression in this extraordinary poverty. Right, never mind the 8 kids, And he's one of the first people to join the Second World War, and he is killed in Tobruk. And it's a very, very beautiful, poignant story. And we follow the lives of the kids and all the rest of it. And we had this premiere in Melbourne, and when it finished, the entire cinema was silent. And I was sitting up the front, and I thought, fucking hell, they hate it. And then the whole cinema started crying. It was just extraordinary. It was chilling. But having said that, it's not a bad history of Tobruk, and some of the war in North Africa. We don't hear too much about that. Early 1940, 41, and it was picked up by a Canadian television station, and it did very well in Canada. And the reason I'm telling you this story is I'm getting around to making history palatable. I think is what you're kind of getting there. How do you make it for a broad audience and everything? But anyway, this Canadian producer came up to me and he said, that film, Love Letters from, it worked really well. And he said, you know what you did? You made a chick flick about the war. I thought, fantastic. I love that.
Now, Tom's winked to give me the wink that the sausage rolls are getting cold, so yours is the last question. Who was it? Oh, Paul, sorry.
You mentioned at the end that Bean was working on an unofficial history of the war. Did you have any sense of what prompted that? Of that sort of revision, change of mind about certain aspects?
Oh, not as such. No, only than any. The things we can all infer that this is a man approaching the end of his life. He had been then 20 years away from, at least, away from the history. And I figure that's a time you revisit. But it's also probably an older man, and it's his youth. And, so no real reason, I guess, but all of the ones we probably imagine.
Wouldn't there be lots of things he could have put in official history? Like his own?
Absolutely, that's part of what the manuscript's like, isn't it?
Yeah.
No, I'm going to bring things to a halt because otherwise Tom will eat the sausage rolls, and I don't want that to happen. Hang on, don't sit down. I've got 3 things to say. One is he's selling DVDs out there, so buy them before you touch the sausage rolls. Second point is to acknowledge again that Jeff was in the film, and we all appreciate the meaning of that. The third thing is, of course, we're coming back tomorrow. It's 9 o'clock start. Talking about official histories, focus switches from Bean specifically to official histories, especially looking at the future. And the last thing to do is to thank you for sticking the course. It's been a long day, an arduous day, an emotionally draining day for many of us, and I very much appreciate your attendance and participation. Thank you very much.